The prairie was a lonely place after sundown, a wide ocean of grass stretched under a moon that seemed too far away to care. Its light fading over a horizon that bled into blackness. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust, of something forgotten by God and man alike. To most, this land was death, too dry, too cruel, too vast. But to Thomas Keene it was home, or rather what was left of one. He rode slowly, shoulders slumped under the weight of years in silence. His hat was pulled low, hiding a face weathered like old leather carved by sun and sorrow. His horse, an aging mare named Daisy, walked the trail with the same tired rhythm, the sound of hooves falling like a clock counting down the moments between life and loneliness. The rancher had once been known as a man of pride, of faith, of purpose. Now they called him the Forgotten Rancher, a man who outlived everything he loved and just kept on breathing, because the land refused to let him die. The night was cold enough to bite through his coat. He'd been out searching for a stray mare since morning, a fool's errand, he knew. The animal had likely been taken by coyotes or rustlers, but he needed something to chase, something to keep him from staring too long at the empty porch where his wife used to sit with her sewing, humming soft songs that had outlasted the warmth of her hands. She'd been gone 7 winters now, buried on the hill overlooking the creek. The wooden cross had long since tilted, half swallowed by tall grass and time. Still, Thomas rode by it every morning, tipped his hat and muttered words no one heard. He was halfway down the ridge when he heard it, faint at first, almost like the wind dragging a ghost through the pines. A cry, sharp, human, desperate. He froze in his saddle, head turning toward the sound. Another cry followed, higher this time, edged with terror. Wolves, and not far. Instinct moved faster than thought. He dismounted, boots crunching in the frost as he untied his rifle from the saddle. The night was alive with sound now, the low growl of predators circling something unseen, the ragged breathing of the wind through the brush. His heart, long hardened by grief, began to pound with the clarity of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He moved toward the sound, careful, crouched low, his lantern swinging weakly in his left hand. Between the trees, a small figure stumbled into view. At first he thought it was a child, then the light caught her face. Brown skin painted with ash and dirt, hair tangled with feathers and dried blood. She was Apache, no older than 14, her eyes wide with terror as 3 wolves prowled around her, lean and hungry from the winter's scarcity. She clutched a small bone necklace in one hand, her other arm bloodied from a bite. Her legs gave out as one of the wolves lunged. Thomas didn't think. He fired once, the shot cracking through the silence like thunder. One wolf fell, another snarled and backed away, but the third kept coming, eyes burning gold in the lamplight. Thomas dropped the lantern, leveled the rifle, and shot again. The recoil knocked him back a step, the sound echoing across the valley. Silence followed, thick, heavy, final. The girl collapsed onto the dirt, breathing shallow and fast. He hurried to her side, his boots sinking into the cold soil. The wolves lay still. Only the wind moved now. She stared up at him with a gaze that didn't flinch, fierce, unbroken. Her lips trembled as she whispered something in her tongue. It wasn't a plea. It sounded like a prayer, spoken to the spirits of her ancestors, not to him. He knelt beside her, unsure what to say. "You're safe now," he whispered. The words felt strange in his mouth, dry from disuse. She didn't answer, only closed her eyes as though the act of staying awake had cost her everything she had left. He lifted her gently, cradling her light body in his arms. She was trembling, ice-cold but alive. Blood soaked the torn hem of her dress and her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird beneath his fingertips. He carried her to his horse, wrapping his coat around her shoulders before mounting. Daisy whinnied uneasily at the scent of blood and wolves, but obeyed his command as he guided her back toward the ranch. It was a long ride through the darkness. The land stretched endless, empty, indifferent to the small flicker of life he carried against his chest. By the time he reached the ranch, the horizon had begun to pale, the first light of dawn staining the sky a faint rose. He brought her inside, kicking open the warped door with his boot. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and solitude. The hearth was still warm from the morning's fire. He laid her on the cot beside it, the blanket rough but clean. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. He poured whiskey into a basin, tore a strip from his old shirt, and began cleaning her wounds. She didn't move. Only when the alcohol touched her skin did her lips tighten. She didn't cry. He worked carefully, his rough hands shaking slightly. The wound on her arm was deep but clean enough to heal. The bite on her leg would scar, but she would live. When he finished, He wrapped her in a blanket and sat back, studying her face in the flickering firelight. It was a face both fierce and fragile. Her cheekbones were sharp, her lashes long. She was beautiful in the way untamed things are beautiful. Not because they are gentle, but because they endure. For the first time in years, the cabin wasn't silent. Her breathing filled the air. It was faint but steady. Thomas leaned back in his chair, feeling something stir in him that he thought had died with his wife. It wasn't love, not yet. It was simply life. The sound of another human being alive in his house, and it broke him a little inside. Outside, a wolf howled from the far ridge. He glanced toward the window, his reflection dark against the dawn. The girl shifted slightly, murmuring something in her sleep. He caught only one word, Luna. He thought she was dreaming, but the name stayed with him. When she woke that afternoon, she didn't speak. She only watched him, eyes alert, cautious. Thomas tried talking anyway, filling the silence with the kind of words a man says to remind himself he's still human. He told her about the storm that had torn through the plains last week, about his wife, about the land and how cruel it could be. She listened without expression. Only once did she look at him with something like curiosity, when he asked if she wanted food. She nodded then, and for the first time, he saw the faintest ghost of a smile. Days turned to weeks. The girl stayed. She never told him her real name, so he called her Luna. She didn't object. She began helping him around the ranch, feeding the horses, fetching water, tending to the small patch of vegetables that somehow survived the cold. She rarely spoke, but she was quick to learn. Thomas found himself talking more each day. Sometimes, when the evening light fell soft across the prairie, he'd catch her looking toward the west, where the land stretched to the mountains. There was always a longing in her eyes, a quiet ache that matched his own. And then one morning, she was gone. The cabin door was open, swinging gently in the wind. Her bed was empty. She had left behind the blanket, the clothes he'd given her, and on the wooden table a carving. An eagle wing spread cut from bone, the same bone that had hung around her neck the night he found her. He stood there a long time, the fire crackling low behind him, the morning sun creeping across the floorboards. Something inside him broke in a way it hadn't since his wife died. Not the violent kind of break that tears a man apart, but the quiet one that leaves him hollow. He whispered her name, Luna, and it hung in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. For years, Thomas Keene lived with that silence. He aged alone, growing slower, grayer. The ranch aged with him, fences leaning, paint peeling, memories fading. But every so often, he'd hear the wolves again in the night, and the sound would pull him back to that moonlit moment. The night the wolves came, the night he'd found her. 15 years passed. The world turned colder, crueler. Towns rose and fell. The railroad came, and one summer evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge and the wind stirred the grass like whispers from the dead, Thomas saw dust rising from the valley. Riders, a whole band of them, Apache warriors, proud and fierce beneath banners of red and gold. Their leader rode at the front, tall and strong, her hair braided with feathers, her skin painted with the marks of command. Around her neck hung a bone necklace, and carved into her saddle was an eagle. When her eyes met his across the field, the years between them vanished. He didn't have to ask. He knew she had returned. The wind came from the south that summer, carrying dust and the faint smell of rain. Thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills, and the horizon shimmered under the weight of heat. Thomas Keene stood on his porch, leaning on the railing that had long since splintered from neglect. His hands were rough, his knuckles swollen from age and work. His eyes were pale now, washed of color like river stones. He had learned to live in quiet, to make peace with solitude. But that evening, as he watched the approaching riders, a strange tremor rippled through his chest, like a heartbeat waking after a long sleep. There were 8 of them, proud men on painted horses, their bodies wrapped in woven blankets, faces marked with war paint and dust. At their head rode a woman unlike any Thomas had ever seen. She carried herself like someone born to lead, back straight, chin high, eyes fixed ahead with the kind of calm that made others lower theirs. Her hair was black as a raven's wing, braided with feathers and beads that shimmered when the sun caught them. Around her neck hung a necklace of carved bone, and on the front of her saddle was an eagle, its wings spread in flight. She stopped her horse a few paces from the porch. For a long moment, neither spoke. The prairie seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind quieted as if waiting. The woman dismounted slowly, her movements deliberate, graceful, When she stepped forward, Thomas saw the scar running along her left arm, the same mark the wolf had left 15 years before. His throat tightened. "You've come back," he whispered. The woman studied him, her gaze steady and unreadable. Then in a voice low and calm but edged with power, she said, "You are the one who saved me." Her English was clear now, her accent soft but firm. "Long ago, when the wolves came." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "You remember?" "I remember everything," she said. "Your fire, your voice, your kindness, and the way you looked at me as if I were not a ghost in your land." Her words cut through him, gentle but sharp, each syllable carrying the weight of time. "What should I call you now?" he asked finally. She hesitated, then answered, "My people call me Naya. In the tongue of my mother's tribe, it means the one who returns." Naya. The name fit her like the sky fit the earth. Inevitable, endless. He motioned for her to come inside, but she shook her head. Her men waited in silence, their eyes watchful, hands resting on their reins. She spoke to them in Apache, quick and fluid, her words like the sound of wind rushing through grass. They nodded and rode off toward the river, leaving her alone with him. The two stood facing each other, surrounded by the vast emptiness of the plains. Thomas felt as though the years had folded in on themselves. It was as if time had bent, bringing back a piece of his past that he thought he'd lost to the wilderness. "You've changed," he said quietly. Naya smiled faintly. 15 years will do that. I was a child then. Now I lead a people, a chief," she nodded. "Our old chief died 3 winters ago. His spirit walked into the next world, and the council chose me to guide those who remained." Her eyes darkened slightly. "But our world grows smaller. The white man's fences grow larger. Their towns, their laws, they move across the land like fire. Soon there will be nothing left for us to return to." Thomas looked away, his jaw tightening. He knew she was right. He'd seen it himself. Railroads cutting through valleys where buffalo once ran. Soldiers riding out with iron and greed. He'd seen the way settlers looked at Apache families passing through town. Fear, hate, ignorance. "I never wanted this," he said. "Nor did I," she replied softly. "But the land does not ask what we want." For a long time they said nothing. Thunder rumbled again, closer now, the sky bruised with gathering storm clouds. Naya walked toward the barn, her fingers grazing the old wood, tracing the marks of time. She paused when she reached the open gate where the fence line met the field. "You kept this place alive," she said. He chuckled dryly. "Barely. Most days I wonder who's keeping who alive." She turned to him then, her expression softening for the first time. "You are a stubborn man, Thomas Keene," he smiled faintly. "Been called worse." The storm broke not long after, the sky tearing open with rain. They took shelter in the cabin, where the smell of wet earth drifted in through the open window. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking the walls. Thomas lit the fire, and the light danced against the floorboards, filling the small room with warmth. For a while neither spoke. The only sound was the rain drumming on the roof and the wind pushing at the door. Naya stood near the fire, her shadow stretching across the floor. The flickering light made her look almost otherworldly, half spirit, half woman. She took off her necklace, setting it on the table beside the carving she had left all those years ago. The bone eagle still there, yellowed with age. "You kept it," she said softly. "I never throw away what matters," he replied. She looked at him then, and something passed between them. Something fragile, like a bridge rebuilt over the ruins of time. "I came because my people travel north soon," she said. "We seek peace with the soldiers near the San Pedro River. But there are men who want war instead. The army hunts us like wolves, and in their eyes all Apache are the same. There are women, children, elders who cannot keep running." Thomas studied her face, the strength in it, the pain hidden beneath it. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd once carried from the jaws of death. She was a leader now, fierce and burdened by the weight of a world too cruel for innocence. "And what do you want from me?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Help," she said at last. "A place to rest. Food for my people. A friend I can still trust." Thomas looked at her for a long time. He saw the same defiance he'd seen that night, the same light that refused to die. He nodded. "You'll have it." A slow breath escaped her lips like relief long withheld. She reached out then, and for the briefest moment her fingers brushed his hand. It was a small thing, a simple touch, but it sent a tremor through them both. Neither spoke of it, yet the silence that followed was heavier than words. Outside, the rain poured harder, washing the land clean, and in the flickering light of that small cabin, an old rancher and a young Apache chief stood on the edge of two worlds, bound by a moment neither of them could forget. Standing between the ghosts of the past and the storm of what was coming, he poured 2 cups of coffee, black and bitter as midnight, and handed one to her. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his again. "You drink this every day?" she asked, half curious, half teasing. "Every morning," he said. "Keeps me alive." "Then I see why you're still standing." For the first time he laughed. Not the shallow, forced laugh of an old man trying to remember how. It was real. Rough. Human. And when she smiled back, it was like dawn breaking through a storm that had lasted 15 years. They talked until the rain stopped, their voices low, carried by the crackle of fire. She told him stories of her people, the songs sung by the river, the dances at dawn, the wars fought to protect the land her ancestors had walked. He told her about the ranch, the years alone, the dreams that had turned to dust. As night gave way to silence, she looked toward the door, her expression unreadable. "The world is changing," she said. "For you, for me, for everyone." He nodded. "Then we'll face it together." And though neither said it aloud, both knew that something deeper had begun. A quiet bond rekindled by time, by memory, by the kind of love that grows not from passion, but from shared survival. The forgotten rancher had saved the Apache girl once. Now she had returned, not as a child, but as a woman with a tribe, a past, and a storm of her own to fight, and neither of them yet knew how much that promise to face it together would cost them both. The next morning broke under a sky swollen with clouds the color of gunmetal. The air smelled of rain and iron, and the land felt restless, like it could sense the trouble that rode its way. Thomas Keene stood by the corral, watching the horizon while the last wisps of mist clung to the hills. In the distance, thin trails of smoke rose from campfires, Apache fires. They had come. By noon, the valley below the ranch was filled with motion. Families on horseback. Elders wrapped in blankets of red and brown. Young warriors riding alongside them like shadows. The sound of their arrival echoed faintly. Drums, hooves, the murmured rhythm of a people always on the move. To Thomas, it felt like watching a tide come in. Something vast and unstoppable, beautiful and mournful at once. Naya rode at the head, her hair braided with white feathers that caught the light. Behind her came 2 elders and a dozen warriors carrying bows, rifles, and spears. She dismounted with quiet dignity, her eyes meeting Thomas's as though no time had passed between them. "We'll stay near the creek," she said. "The land is soft there, and the horses will drink well." "You're welcome to all of it," Thomas replied. "This land's more yours than mine anyway." She looked at him then, something flickering behind her calm exterior. "Few white men would say that," he shrugged. "Most of them never learned to listen to it. The land don't belong to anyone who can't hear it breathe." Her lips curved just slightly, a ghost of a smile that carried the weight of old understanding. For 3 days, the Apache camped along the creek. Thomas brought them sacks of grain and flour from the old storage shed, tools, and what little salt he had left. In return, the elders offered him smoked meat and handmade trinkets carved from stone and bone. At night, the sound of drums rolled softly through the valley, low and steady, like a heartbeat carried on the wind. But peace was fragile. A thin thread stretched too tight between worlds. Word spread fast across the nearby town of Dry Creek. Settlers talked in hushed, fearful tones over whiskey glasses and poker tables, that Indians had taken up camp on the Keene Ranch, that the old rancher had gone mad, that the army should be told. By the 4th day, riders from the fort appeared. 3 men in blue coats, faces hard and eyes colder than the steel they carried. They came without warning, the dust from their horses rising like a storm cloud. Thomas saw them from his porch before they even reached the gate. The lead man, a captain named Silas Morrow, dismounted first. He had the kind of face carved from cruelty, handsome once maybe, but now twisted with arrogance. "You Keene?" he barked. Thomas nodded slowly. "Been him for a while." "We heard you're harboring hostile natives on this property." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I'm not harboring anyone. They're guests. Tired people passing through. They've hurt no one." Morrow spat into the dirt. "We've had reports of raids up near San Pedro. A stagecoach burned last week. Settlers are scared. My orders are to make sure no band of savages camps within a mile of the trade road." Thomas met his stare, steady as a man who'd faced worse than soldiers. Then your orders are worthless here. These people aren't your enemy. The captain's lips curled. You've gone soft, old man. Maybe you forgot which side you're on. I ain't on any side that calls mercy a weakness. Morrow's hand twitched toward his pistol, but he didn't draw. He looked past Thomas toward the valley, where Naya stood at the edge of her camp watching. The wind caught her hair, the feathers glinting in the afternoon sun. That her? Morrow asked. The one they call Chief? She's not yours to question, Thomas said quietly. Everything on this frontier is mine to question, Morrow sneered. He turned back to his horse. Tell her she's got 2 days to move her people north. If she doesn't, we'll move them for her. Thomas didn't answer. He watched them ride away, their laughter echoing behind them like the sound of chains dragged across stone. When they were gone, the land felt emptier and the air thicker with unease. That night, Thomas walked down to the Apache camp. The firelight flickered across faces both weary and worn. Women stirred stew in iron pots. Children slept near the embers, and warriors stood at the edges of the camp like statues guarding the last piece of peace they had left. Naya sat alone by the river, her reflection shimmering in the water. The moonlight painted her in silver, and for a moment she looked ageless, a woman caught between two worlds, burdened by both. They came, she said without looking up. He nodded. They'll come again. They always do. He sat beside her. The air smelled of smoke and rain-soaked earth. They gave you 2 days. I know. She picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the river. 2 days is what men give before they burn villages. He turned to her, the firelight catching the lines in his face. You've fought before? She nodded slowly. I was 12 when I saw my first battle. Soldiers burned our camp near the canyon. My father died there. My mother too. I remember the smell of the smoke, the sound of horses screaming. I remember running. Her voice broke just slightly. The night you found me, I had been running again. From the same kind of men. I never forgot the sound of those wolves, or your face when you reached for me instead of running the other way. The silence between them deepened. He could hear the rush of the water, the soft crackle of fire behind them, the quiet hum of life trying to hold on. You were just a child, he said gently. She looked at him then, eyes glistening in the dark. And now I'm a chief, and I still run. He wanted to say something that could undo the years of pain in her voice, but there were no words strong enough to mend that kind of wound. Instead, he reached for her hand. Her fingers were calloused, her palm warm. She didn't pull away. They sat that way until the night grew old. The stars shifted and the world seemed to shrink to the space between them. Two souls scarred by different wars, both trying to believe that goodness could still exist. In the morning, soldiers would return. The settlers would whisper more lies. The storm that had been gathering for years would finally break. But for now, the land was quiet and the river kept its secrets. When the first light of dawn touched the plains, Naya rose. She turned to Thomas and said, Whatever happens, I will not let them take the land without a fight. Thomas met her gaze. Then I'll fight beside you. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes dark, steady, and filled with a sorrow that had learned to live beside strength. Then the spirits brought me back to the right man, she said softly. And as the wind swept through the valley, stirring the grass and carrying the promise of blood and fire, Thomas Keene knew that he had once again found something worth dying for. The morning came heavy with dust and dread. The sun rose blood-red over the plains, its light muted by the haze that hung in the valley. The air was still and too still. Even the horses seemed uneasy, snorting softly, shifting their weight as though the earth itself had turned restless beneath them. Thomas Keene stood on the porch with his rifle leaning against the wall. He had hardly slept. All night the sky had flickered with distant lightning, but no rain had fallen. Only heat and silence. From his porch he could see the Apache camp stretched out by the creek, smoke rising from their fires, women stirring breakfast, children running barefoot through the tall grass. For a brief moment it looked almost peaceful, almost normal. But peace on the frontier was a fragile lie. It was a dream whispered between storms, and Thomas knew it couldn't last. Just after noon he saw them coming, a dust cloud rolling across the southern ridge. 30 soldiers, maybe more. At their head rode Captain Silas Morrow, his blue coat bright against the dull land, his face hard and certain, the kind of certainty that came not from justice but from arrogance. Thomas's stomach tightened. He picked up his rifle and walked down the hill. Naya met him halfway, mounted on her horse. She wore a band of red cloth around her arm. Her hair braided tight, her eyes burning with resolve. Behind her, a dozen Apache warriors stood waiting, their weapons ready but lowered. "They're coming sooner than expected," she said. "They never wait long when it comes to killing," he answered. She nodded slowly. "My people are ready to move to the mountains if we must." He looked at her, his voice rough. "They'll chase you. Then they'll have to earn the chase." He couldn't help but admire her. The calm in her voice, the quiet power that radiated from her even as danger loomed. She was not the frightened child he had rescued years ago. She was fire now, unyielding, unstoppable, and fiercely alive. The soldiers arrived at the edge of the creek by mid-afternoon. The valley fell silent except for the steady clop of their horses and the rattle of weapons. The sight of them, rows of men with rifles, bayonets glinting in the sunlight, stirred something ancient and furious inside Thomas. Captain Morrow rode forward, smirking. "Well, I see you didn't take my advice, old man." Thomas didn't move. "They're not hurting anyone. That's not your call to make." Morrow turned his horse toward Naya. "You, Chief." Naya stared up at him, her chin lifted. "My people mean no harm. We travel north for peace." "Peace," he repeated, mocking the word. "You and your kind don't understand peace. You understand taking, burning, killing. I'm here to make sure that ends." "You don't bring peace," she said evenly. "You bring death and call it order." The men behind Morrow laughed, low, mean laughter that crawled under Thomas's skin. He took a step forward. "You'll leave them be," he said, voice like gravel. "You got no right to come here." Morrow's expression turned cold. "Stand aside, Keen. This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment you threatened them." Morrow's eyes narrowed. "You protect savages now? After all they've done?" Thomas met his stare without flinching. "I protect whoever's right." The air went still. Somewhere a hawk cried high above the valley. The silence was thick enough to choke on. Then a shot rang out, sharp and sudden. No one knew who fired first. Some said it came from the soldiers' side. Others swore it came from the trees. But once the sound echoed through the valley, everything broke. Chaos exploded like fire. Rifles cracked. Horses screamed, and the air filled with smoke and dust. Apache warriors ducked behind rocks, firing back with whatever they had. Women grabbed their children and ran for the river. Thomas dove for cover, his ears ringing from the sound of gunfire. He saw Naya's horse rear up, struck by a bullet. She fell hard but rolled to her feet. Bow drawn in one hand, knife in the other, she moved with the speed of someone who had fought her whole life. Silent, sure, deadly. Morrow shouted orders from the ridge. "Drive them out!" No one left standing. Rage burned through Thomas like wildfire. He grabbed his rifle and took aim. One of the soldiers was reloading near the wagon trail. Thomas fired and the man dropped. His hands shook, not from fear but from the weight of what he'd just done. He hadn't killed anyone since the war. Now he had blood on his hands again. But this time he didn't regret it. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 20 minutes. When the smoke began to clear, the ground was littered with bodies. Blue coats, red cloths, blood mingling in the dirt. And then silence. Thomas staggered toward the river. He saw Naya kneeling beside one of her fallen warriors, his chest still. Her hands trembled as she pressed his eyes closed. The strength she'd shown moments ago seemed to collapse under the weight of grief. "He was my brother," she whispered. Thomas knelt beside her, his throat tight. "I'm sorry." She looked up at him, eyes burning. "Don't be sorry. Be ready." Her words sent a chill through him. A faint sound echoed from the ridge. More riders. Soldiers. Reinforcements. Morrow had called for backup before the fight began. Naya rose to her feet, her face pale but resolute. "We can't stay. Take the women and the wounded to the hills." Thomas looked toward his ranch, the house he'd built with his wife, the barn, the corral. His whole life. "They'll burn it," he said quietly. She placed her hand on his arm. "Then let it burn. You can build again." "My people cannot." The words cut deep, truer than anything he'd heard in years. He nodded slowly. Together, they led the survivors toward the mountain pass at dusk. The sky blazed orange and red behind them, the color of fire and blood. The wind howled across the plains like a morning song. When they reached the ridge, Thomas looked back one last time. His ranch was already burning. Flames climbed the roof, swallowing the home he had built, the memories he had kept alive for so long. But even as he watched it burn, he didn't feel despair, only clarity. He turned to Naya, who stood beside him, her silhouette fierce against the firelit sky. "You were right," he said. "The land doesn't ask what we want." She met his gaze, her voice soft but steady. "No, but it remembers who we are." They stood together as night fell, a forgotten rancher and an Apache chief, both carrying the ashes of their past, both walking toward a future carved by blood, loss, and something deeper than either of them had yet dared to name. And behind them, the wind carried the last cry of the dying West, the sound of a world ending and another, uncertain one, beginning. The fire burned through the night, turning the valley into a sea of red and black. The wind howled down from the ridge, carrying sparks that danced like dying stars before fading into the endless dark. Thomas Keene stood on the mountainside, watching the flames devour his life piece by piece. The old barn collapsed first, its roof groaning before falling in on itself with a roar. The cabin followed, the window panes shattering in bursts of light. The porch, where he had once watched the sunrise beside the woman he loved, where he had first seen Naya return after 15 years, was gone in a blink. But he didn't look away. He watched it all burn, silent and still, as if bearing witness to the death of an old world he no longer belonged to. Beside him, Naya stood wrapped in a woven blanket, her expression unreadable. Her people had gathered deeper in the mountain pass, women tending to the wounded, men guarding the narrow trail with bows and worn rifles. Behind them, the sound of horses echoed faintly in the distance. Soldiers, searching. The air was cold now, and the smell of smoke clung to everything, to their skin, their hair, their clothes. Thomas's throat burned when he spoke. That house was all I had left of her. Naya didn't answer right away. She looked down at the valley where the last embers glowed like scattered jewels. "Sometimes the fire takes what we love," she said softly, "but sometimes it gives us back what we are." He turned toward her, the light of the flames catching in her dark eyes. "And what am I now?" She studied him for a long time before replying. "A man who chose the living over the dead." Her words struck him deeper than she could have known. For years he had lived like a ghost, tending to the land, talking to memories, waiting for time to erase him. And now, for the first time in 15 years, he had chosen to stand for something again, to fight for the living. They moved deeper into the mountains before dawn. The trail was steep and narrow, winding between ridges of rock that glowed pale beneath the moonlight. Thomas carried one of the wounded boys, barely 16, shot in the leg. The boy's breathing was ragged, and every few steps he whimpered but never complained. The Apache moved in silence, their steps sure and soft. The women led the horses, whispering prayers to the spirits of the mountain as they climbed. By sunrise, they reached a small plateau overlooking the valley. A stream ran nearby, cold and clean. It wasn't home, but it was safety. For now. Naya gave the orders quietly, and the tribe began to settle. They built small fires, covered the wounded with hides, and gathered roots and herbs from the mountain brush. The older men sat in a circle, murmuring among themselves, their faces carved with lines of fatigue and sorrow. Thomas found himself beside Naya again as she knelt by the stream, washing blood from her hands. The water ran pink for a moment before turning clear again. He crouched beside her, his knees aching from the long climb. "How many did we lose?" he asked. She didn't look up. 9. 3 of them were children. He bowed his head. "God help us." She let the water run through her fingers, her reflection rippling. "Your God," she said quietly, "and mine. Both have been silent for too long." He didn't argue. He couldn't. As the day went on, the mountain came alive with the slow rhythm of survival. The Apache rebuilt what they could from nothing. They cooked, tended to the wounded, and sang low songs that echoed off the rocks. There was grief in every sound, but also a strange, quiet strength. That night, Thomas sat by a small fire, staring into the flames. The heat bit at his skin, but the cold inside him would not fade. Naya joined him, sitting across the fire. Her face was illuminated by the soft, flickering light. She looked tired, the kind of tired that came from years of running, fighting, and burying her people. But there was still fire in her eyes. "You blame yourself," she said after a long silence. He looked up sharply. "Don't you?" She shook her head. "I have no time for blame, only for what must be done next." He leaned forward, his voice rough. "And what is that?" "We move again," she said. "The soldiers will follow. They always do. You can't keep running forever. No, she said, but I can keep my people alive long enough to see a day when they don't have to. Her resolve both broke and inspired him. He looked into the fire, watching the wood crumble into embers. You remind me of her, he said quietly. Naya's gaze softened. Your wife? He nodded. Emma. She was strong like you. Gentle too, but she had that same fire. Never gave up on me even when I'd already given up on myself. She must have loved you deeply, Naya said. He smiled faintly. She did, and I didn't understand what that meant until it was too late. The fire popped softly, sending a flurry of sparks into the night. For a while they sat without speaking. Then Naya's voice broke the silence again, soft but certain. You saved me once, she said, but maybe I was sent back to save you. He looked up at her, startled. You lived in the past, she continued, buried with your ghosts. The wolves didn't just come for me that night. They came for you too. And now, she reached across the fire, her fingers brushing his hand. We're both still here. His throat tightened. There were no words strong enough to carry what he felt in that moment. Gratitude, sorrow, longing, love, all tangled into something raw and wordless. Above them, the stars stretched endlessly across the sky. The world below might have been burning, but up there, the universe still shimmered like it always had. As the wind whispered through the trees, Naya spoke again, a single phrase, almost a whisper. The mountains remember those who seek peace, she said. But peace demands its price. Thomas didn't ask what she meant. He could already feel it, the weight of it pressing on both their hearts. The next morning, scouts returned with news. Soldiers had been seen moving toward the foothills, a large force, more than before. And with them came wagons and supplies for a siege. The mountain would not protect them forever. Naya listened without a word, her expression calm, but her eyes dark with thought. When the scout finished, she turned to Thomas. We will not run this time, she said. If they want a war, they'll find one waiting. He looked at her, this woman who had risen from the ashes of her people, who had lost everything and yet refused to break, and he felt something he hadn't in decades. Faith. Faith not in God, not in the law, but in her. Then I'll stand with you, he said quietly. And as the cold wind swept through the mountains, carrying with it the echo of approaching drums and the promise of battle, Thomas Keene knew the end was coming. But for the first time in his long, lonely life, he wasn't afraid. The wind had changed. It carried the scent of iron and smoke, of dust rising from the lowlands where soldiers marched. From the high ridge above the valley, Thomas Keene could see their movement. Small dots at first, but growing larger, clearer and hungrier with every passing hour. The soldiers were coming fast, their columns stretching across the plain like the shadow of something inevitable. The mountain air was sharp that morning, cold enough to sting the lungs. The Apache camp was quiet. No songs, no laughter, not even the sound of children. Just the rustle of wind through the pines and the faint crack of distant gunfire echoing through memory. The people moved with purpose, sharpening weapons, tending fires, preparing for what everyone already knew. The fight wasn't just for life. It was for memory, for the right to still exist when the dust settled. Naya stood near the edge of the cliff, watching the soldiers approach with the calm of a woman who had seen too much to fear anything anymore. The sun caught the red cloth tied around her arm, the color of blood but also of courage. Her horse waited behind her, restless, sensing what was to come. Thomas approached slowly, his steps heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. The days since the battle at the ranch had aged him more than the last decade. His hair had gone white at the temples and the lines around his eyes had deepened, but there was strength in him still, a quiet, unshakable strength that came from knowing this was his last fight, and that it meant something. They'll reach us by noon, she said without turning. Then we've got a few hours left to breathe, he replied. Naya exhaled slowly, her breath clouding in the chill air. I once thought peace would find us here, she murmured, that the mountains would keep us safe, but there is no safe place left. He looked at her, his voice rough with tenderness. You've kept them alive longer than anyone thought possible. And when I fall, she said, another will rise. The land always remembers its children. He stepped closer, close enough to smell the faint scent of smoke in her hair. You're not going to fall. She turned then, her dark eyes meeting his, eyes that had seen the worst of men and yet still held light. Thomas, she said softly, You can still leave. There's a narrow pass to the west. If you ride now, you can make it before they close in. He shook his head. I left too many people before. I'm done running. For a long moment, they said nothing. Only the wind spoke, low and mournful, carrying whispers from the valley below. Naya reached out, her hand brushing his cheek. It was a gesture both fierce and fragile, filled with everything they hadn't spoken aloud. Then we stand together, she said. He nodded, and in that nod was a promise, not of survival, but of loyalty until the end. By mid-morning, the soldiers appeared in full view, hundreds of them, riding hard. The sound of hooves and the jingle of metal filled the air like thunder rolling over dry land. Banners whipped in the wind. Rifles gleamed in the sun. At their head rode Captain Silas Morrow, his face grim, his pride burning brighter than his reason. This is your last warning. Morrow shouted, his voice echoing up the ridge. Lay down your weapons and surrender, or we'll burn you out. Naya stood at the edge of the camp, her posture unbroken, her voice carrying like wind through stone. You already burned our homes. You killed our children. There is nothing left to take. Morrow scowled. Then you'll die here. We were born dying, she said. But we live free. The soldiers moved forward. The Apache waited until they reached the base of the ridge, and then the mountain came alive. The first shots rang out, sharp and merciless. Smoke burst from behind rocks and arrows whistled through the air. Men fell from their horses, the echoes of battle bouncing off the cliffs like the tolling of a funeral bell. Thomas fired from behind a boulder, reloading with trembling hands, every muscle screaming with effort. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, but he didn't stop. He saw the faces of the men charging, boys, most of them, and forced himself not to think about their mothers, their fathers, their small-town dreams. He had lived long enough to know that wars were never between good and evil. They were between griefs. Naya fought near the front, her bow moving faster than the eye could follow. She was fire incarnate, striking, retreating, leading her people with courage that defied the heavens. When a bullet grazed her arm, she didn't flinch. She kept fighting. Her eyes locked on Morrow, who pushed his men higher with each command. The battle raged for hours. Smoke blanketed the mountain, choking the air. Cries of the dying mingled with the scream of wind through the canyons. One by one, Thomas watched the Apache fall. Men he had shared food with, women who had sung by the fires, the young and the brave alike. Still they fought. When his rifle ran empty, Thomas drew his revolver. A bullet struck the rock near his head, spraying dirt across his face. He ducked, fired twice, and saw one soldier fall. Another rushed him, bayonet ready. Thomas turned too slow. The soldier lunged, and then fell, an arrow buried in his chest. Thomas turned. Naya stood a few feet away, breathing hard, blood on her shoulder. You shouldn't have done that, he said hoarsely. You saved me once, she said. I'm only giving it back. But she was pale now, her movement slower. Blood soaked the cloth tied around her arm. The soldiers pressed closer. The Apache line faltered. The end had come. Thomas caught her as she stumbled. He dragged her behind the last line of rocks, his voice breaking. Naya, stay with me. She gripped his coat, her breath shallow. It's time. No, he said, shaking his head. No, you hear me? You're going to live. Her lips curved faintly, the hint of a smile. The land takes back what it loves. Her eyes fluttered shut, and for a moment the world went still. The smoke drifted. The gunfire faded. Everything slowed to silence. Thomas pressed his forehead to hers, tears cutting through the dust on his face. You came back, he whispered. You came back. In the distance, the soldiers regrouped, their victory hollow. Morrow looked down from his horse at the fallen, his expression blank. The mountain had claimed more than he could ever understand. When the shooting stopped and the last echo of violence disappeared into the wind, Thomas sat alone beside her. The sun was sinking now, bleeding across the sky in the color of rust and sorrow. He buried her where the wind met the water, beneath a tree that overlooked the valley. The stream below whispered like a lullaby, and the air was heavy with the scent of pine. He carved an eagle into a piece of stone and placed it at her grave. Its wings spread wide, reaching for the sky. You're free now, he said softly, just like you wanted. That night the stars came out one by one. He stayed there until dawn, the fire dying beside him, the world hushed and waiting. When the first light broke over the mountains, Thomas Keene rose. He was old, broken, and alone again. But not the same man who once walked through silence waiting for life to end. He looked out over the land that had taken everything from him, and somehow still given him meaning. And for the first time in years he smiled. He whispered her name, Naya, and the wind carried it into the morning. Across the valley, across the ashes, across the world, and somewhere he thought maybe she heard it.